Real World Ember, where we talk with Ember devs who are awesome, but not necessarily super famous yet. Today we have Joseph, Daniel. Which one do you like to go by again?
I go by Daniel.
All right, cool. So, Daniel, go ahead and tell us a little about yourself. Where do you live and how long have you been programming?
I live in Austin, Texas, and I have been programming in general for a little over 2.5 years.
Uh-huh.
So not too long. And before that, I was working in a completely unrelated industry.
What industry is that?
I was a photographer.
Really? Do you feel like your design skills carry over any?
I feel like I have no design skills.
That would make photography a difficult profession.
Yes, it did. Actually, that's probably not true. I was just overly critical, I feel, of my photography. Mostly, I do think that there's a preference for layout and I have opinions based on that, but working in the design visual space in the programming industry is not really my favorite part or something that I spend a lot of time in, even though I am an Ember JavaScript developer.
Right. I know we've talked some about how you really love doing the more functional side of programming, getting into some of the academic side. Did that start off your interest in programming, or how'd you get started with that?
My interest in programming initially was more out of necessity of wanting to explore a different type of industry and not be a photographer. Not anything too interesting. However, I certainly became obsessed pretty quickly. And I have talked with you before about functional programming, and that isn't directly tied to my sort of disdain for like styling and doing the more visual aspects of being a front-end developer. But I do have, and I realize a lot of people talk about this, so it's sort of a hot topic now, but a belief that a functional style of coding makes your code base inherently safer for like refactoring and change and easier for multiple people to work on and consume, especially larger teams. Saw with React, it can be faster, or with HTML bars as well. And just, collectively, a lot of projects are moving into this functional like way of working sort of together.
Yeah. So how have you seen that happen with Ember? Because Ember, it does have some functional components, but at the beginning it was very object-oriented.
So, well, it's still object-oriented, I would say, and obviously this is just sort of my interpretation or my opinion. I don't represent the collective view on these things, but I think that Ember has, since Sprout Core, had computed properties, and computed properties are basically pure functions. Their dependent keys, as we call them in Ember, are their arguments. You can think of it as the arguments of the function. And, every time we have the same values for those dependent keys, you will always have the same result for your computer property. And that's what enables us to cache it. And that is in functional languages is referred to as a referential transparency. And it is the basis for a lot of concepts in functional programming. And it's really the basis for, I think, how an Ember developer should think about separating their code into functional and imperative pieces, basically pieces that modify state that is required for any UI development, and then more logic calculation type functions. And as much of that as possible can be moved into computer properties, which I feel like is a strong message that I've always got from the Ember community. And that's really a functional message. And so I would say, even though maybe Ember wasn't like messaged as that, from when I first got interested in functional languages and looking at Ember, I saw that and I thought that was where that came from. So I would say Ember is very functional in that way.
Awesome. Yeah, and I agree. Ember computed properties are amazing. And they've definitely helped me make my code much better. Anytime I can replace an observer or a function call with a computed property, I'm going to do it. And so how much of You said as much as possible. How much of Ember code do you think you can turn into computed properties?
Most of it, I would say. Like, the way I think about spitballing here, I would say I would kind of divide the sort of type of code I write into different categories for Ember. There would be the magical type logic that I write a tiny bit of boilerplate and I get, great functionality that really is tested and built into the framework. And I would a good example of that would be query param, stuff that's built into controllers, or I know I said the C word, but I'm not supposed to.
It's okay.
I'm just kidding.
Controllers are going to be relevant for another 2 months or so.
Yeah. So there's the query param logic that is given to us by Ember. Another thing that kind of falls into this that we don't use anymore is like the sortable mix-in, like some of that kind of functionality.
Right. So stuff where it's we're given a DSL and magic happens.
Exactly. So there's that kind of code. Then there is one layer less domain specific where I would say that the hooks, like the route hooks, basically boilerplate to allow us to use our own logic at specific points in setup and teardown. And that's really kind of the essential wrapper for mutation that I think Ember provides. And so basically anything that is not just a calculation, you're going to have to manually mutate that is wherever it lives, like on its prototype or on its object. Obviously, that you want to minimize those, but that will always exist when you are displaying things to a screen and you're keeping up with the state of your screen.
So that mutation you say will happen in various hooks, like did insert element. And it'll also happen in actions. Is there other places where mutation is okay?
So that's primarily it. It's those two. The way I think about it is you need to set something. If you need to explicitly change something, you need it to be a different value than it currently is. One, because you're setting it up for the first time, or you are resetting it. So that would be like on entering and leaving. And Ember provides functions that fire at particular times that we call hooks for that. And then additionally, the only other time that something would not be used as a computer property or something that wouldn't just automatically change, that would have to rely on user input, right? If we're not in the middle of a transition and there's no user input, then unless it's some sort of animation or something that's like changing automatically on a timeout based on some visually obvious thing like a clock changing or something, then really you shouldn't have things that are just firing and like your state shouldn't be changing.
Right.
Most of the time. Would you agree?
Right. And I feel like that's true even if you're not using functional programming.
Right.
I think like the functional part isn't necessarily only doing stuff on user input, because that's most programs that aren't timer based. But the functional part is keeping the mutation to a certain set of methods.
It's keeping it to those two places that we just talked about, is keeping the mutation there. Well, the thing that is enabling, computer properties are enabling us to have a conversation like this because computer properties are saved in the manner that you would, like, they're represented in the manner that you would access a property that you were just manually setting and changing as you're watching the value, say like true or false, or, you know, like a string that may represent different things at different times to be displayed to the screen. But at the same time, it's basically combining a pure function that you would extract out from the function that sets it. So if we were doing this without computer properties, you would basically could make like a helper function, and then you would test that function, and then you would have a function that calls that function that actually would be based on some condition, getting the value, running that pure function with the latest arguments that it needs, and then setting that value as state on the object for a later retrieval.
Right.
And so Ember, the part that is unsafe is that latter part, but Ember handles this in a system that is timed and using like the way that it resolves its dependencies for computer properties, and that combined with the caching is, you know, it conveniently combines those two. So that's why we're saying that all of this is functional, because really it's just, otherwise it would be these functional methods and we're still having to save them in properties, which doesn't seem very functional. Saving state, because then you're having to then replace state on top of it. So that inherently is not functional, but Ember kind of handles that, so we can like give ourselves a break on that and bypass that and just trust computer properties, and then try and limit properties that are manually set, which is what I'm referring to as mutation. Anything that takes a primitive, like a number or a string or a Boolean, or just anything, and then just limit setting those explicitly to route hooks or actions.
Right, because if you set everything manually, that required a certain calculation of properties, then you'd have a bunch of observers. In a better case scenario, then the worst case is observers. But you could also have just like every time one independent property changes, every time you make that change, you have to remember to call change on it and recalculate it and then grab it from elsewhere. And so I consider Ember computed properties, I mean, there's a reason they use the term data flow, because you really can visualizing it flowing from several sources. And based on how those sources, the river changes.
That's right. Yeah. In other languages like Haskell, and then you kind of get this with a Elm, which is a front-end scripting language that's a lot like Haskell.
So wait, have you used Elm lately?
No, not really. So, but I just know the basis.
Okay.
That it's like a pretty true to the original, like,
right.
functional reactive programming.
Yeah, I mean, if you'd used Elm, then we were going to have a separate thing on Ember, just to see if we could make it.
Oh, I see. That's clearly not a thing. It'd be interesting. Yeah, honestly, I'm really torn, because I feel like JavaScript has gotten a lot better, and people that are in the Ember community and the Angular community and the React community, all of them that are investing in these transpilers and these build tools that are allowing us to use and test this new syntax on the fly, that's really facilitated speeding things up with like TC39 and the committees, and everyone that's involved with those efforts have made JavaScript so much better. And, I think that all of us are eternally thankful, because this is the language that we write in every day, and it's just gotten tremendously more accessible and full of features in the past year and a half, 2 years. But other than that gratitude, I also still have feelings where it would be really, like, things like Elm and PureScript are really, really cool.
Yeah, and another good side effect of the ES6 Babel movement, besides making JavaScript better, are that it's made it okay to transpile. Because if you remember 2 or 3 years ago, CoffeeScript was huge among some populations. But the people who didn't like it were like, oh, transpiling, what we write isn't what shows up in the browser. And so despite CoffeeScript being much easier, in my opinion, to write, they freaked out because what they saw on their browser was different than what they wrote. But now that opinion has completely changed because of ES6 and Babel.
Right. And we have source maps, so that we're not actually dealing with that issue. Like, we see more or less what we originally wrote, and it handles that for us. So we're not walking through a bunch of weird stuff.
Well, source maps didn't stop many of the CoffeeScript haters, but I'm definitely glad that we have source maps now.
I remember looking through CoffeeScript. When I was first exposed to CoffeeScript, I was really learning JavaScript for the first time as well. And someone who was mentoring me had written something that they were going to allow me to work on with them, and the whole thing was in CoffeeScript. And it didn't take me long at all to pick up what was going on, as I already had a background in Ruby, but I grasped a handful of JavaScript concepts that I did not know that I needed to care about yet, or did not realize were intricacy of the language by looking at what I had written and looking at what the API, the CoffeeScript API was telling me, and then looking at the output JavaScript. And I learned some valuable things that way. And so I think that helped me early on. So I have nothing but positive things to say. Like, that yielded arrow functions, which are a great thing.
Right, 'cause if you write CoffeeScript that is invalid, it won't transpile.
That's true.
Yeah.
Which is a wonderful thing. And I mean, I think not everybody feels that way, but
I mean, the more I code, the more I appreciate, well, I can't say appreciate because I don't actually work in this world yet, but the more that I see the need for things like types and compiling errors.
yeah, it's pretty, it's always the grass is greener is the approach that, or is kind of what I hear people say, because certainly it seems green to me in the statically compiled land, especially with not everything. I feel like I've only looked at the more functional languages, specifically like Haskell's type system and some Rust and...
Right. I mean, if you go to Java, it's not going to be great, even though it has a type system.
So the difference is that types and classes are coupled. And that inherently complicates things a little bit because the way that your types inherit from each other can, and I would make sure I say this right because I haven't actually worked in one of these languages, but just reading.
That's right. I won't give them your email address. You won't get the hate mail. I will.
Yeah. So types can inherit and share behavior and sort of be polymorphic in nature. It has to do with how polymorphism is implemented. And so Java specifically fixes this with interfaces, which are very similar. Well, I guess they're very similar to type classes in Haskell. And so that's something that's very natural to a language that already has algebraic data types because you are just defining things sort of to have behavior and do whatever they want. And they're separate from like their prototype. They're not, you're not grouping the behavior. So when you start grouping behavior, then that being where behavior is represented in a type like that, it adds complexity that you start having problems with like deeply nested polymorphism and stuff. That's why some of these languages don't attempt like all the nested like
the nested polymorphism of types
that you can the nested. I was trying to think of a different way to say it, but yeah, the recursive polymorphism that you can use in Haskell to like make really abstract things that probably no one else can read or work on later. Like that is, you don't have that depth in all the other type systems. Like that's not very easy to do, or maybe impossible to do without an external library like in Scala, and the same in Java and stuff, because it doesn't go that deep when it evaluates. So
right.
I don't know, these things are really interesting to me. And honestly, I'm a little bit out of my depth here. Like I like talking about them. So these topics, I know enough about them to where they inform the way that I write JavaScript and think about writing code, because I feel like whenever you start learning about these functional concepts and multiple paradigms, like the different paradigms for other languages and how they solve problems, it's kind of seeing how other people see the world. And, it makes you approach things differently and see your own flaws, right? Like we see the flaws more clearly for object-oriented programming, and then you can see and then you remember more why object-oriented programming exists and why we do that instead of
pure functional
procedural, like writing lines of, one line and then another line. And so it makes you appreciate it more, and then it makes you write cleaner code. And you can kind of be a multi-paradigm sort of coder like in a given language, and JavaScript really facilitates that. Like it has its higher order functions, and its prototypal inheritance gives a really great flexibility for doing things in a way that isn't so defined. Like the language is just now having more patterns. Like I think actually you told me one time, maybe I shouldn't quote you on the air like this, but that patterns are features that have not been, language features not yet implemented. And I thought about...
That's I believe it came from the Ruby community, but I think I was the one to tell it to you.
You told it to me.
Yeah, it's when they were talking about, so the pattern language book. You remember the old Gang of Four C pattern language book? And
right.
So when you're trying to translate those to Ruby, a lot of them don't work because Ruby just has a one-liner for it because they've learned from C and they've made these higher order language features that make these patterns obsolete.
Right.
And I think that's wonderful because patterns are sort of the testing ground for new language features. And it's sort of like when we have Babel, where the level 1, level 2 stuff, people are just playing with it. And it's not even, well, I guess it would be like Babel plugins, where it's just people playing, and eventually a lot of people start using it, and then the languages start baking it in.
Right. Or a browser implements it, and then the other browsers implement it. Yeah.
Right.
Another good example, and you made me think of something that I think is sort of interesting, which is it's good that JavaScript is so simple that we are able to implement these features in other languages and we emulate them with their patterns, and have been for however many years. And now, we have syntactic sugar that, will do the same thing under the hood, but it seems more like...
Once you have the powerful primitives, like I remember the first language I learned was Scheme, which is a very simple variant of Lisp. Right. And in the introductory book that I use, you are writing in Scheme, but you end up creating all these data structures that other languages have. And you create it just with these really simple building blocks.
Right.
And so, of course, it's nice to have those. But once you have the easy, like a powerful primitive, you can build up the other primitives. And I've also seen like a book in C where you build an object-oriented interface in just plain old C. Like you build your own hash table. I think that's what it's called. Now I'm out of my depth. But all the things that object-oriented languages implement, you implement that in C.
Yeah. Lisp is a cool language to do that stuff. And
it's a beautiful language. It was the only one I could learn on.
Well, the thing that makes it so great for implementing other features is because it doesn't have it's abstract syntax tree that is its own syntax. So it is its own tree. It doesn't need to be parsed and like recategorized, re-represented in a tree. And so you can build like an interpreter or like language, like a small language really easily and see what you're doing. And it's just really fun. I know no one cares about their own setup more than them, but I recently have been losing my time into Emacs, and the reason why I have invested in Emacs is because over Vim or something else that would be equally as good is because it's a fun excuse to mess around with Lisp and to achieve like goals and to configure my editor, and it's cool. And I highly recommend for people that are using Sublime or Atom or anything like that to experience the all-encompassing, life-engulfing experience that is transition to Emacs. But you might want to schedule some vacation.
Yeah, I hear it takes about a month to really get useful in it.
Yeah. So I was going to respond to something else you were saying. I realized we're kind of tangenting, but...
Oh, we're really tangenting. But before we sort of head out, could you go ahead and tell me a little bit about who you work for?
Yeah, so I work for a company here in Austin, Texas, that the name of the company is Q2, like capital Q, and then 2 software. So we make banking software, and specifically we make an all-encompassing online banking solution that connects a lot of other banking products together for banks and lets them just interact with those things through us. And we connect. So there's a lot of technical, like domain-specific bank stuff that we do that I started describing just now. But the easier way to describe it is that the part that the user sees is an online banking experience, and the best one, that you can think of with the bank that would spend the most money, hire the best team, and you would have the check deposit feature, or the categorization of your money, or any possible social money feature that you could possibly think of. We invest all of our time into making the very best product that can be online banking for customers. And what we do is we make that highly customizable as an Ember app that is deployed. It's a hybrid app, so we wrap it in a native container. It's not Cordova. It's like Cordova. It actually may have started as Cordova, but we have a really smart guy that a couple of them work really hard that have optimized it a whole bunch. And so we're able to deliver that to the Android store, the iPhone store, and also it is our adaptive web app, and it's all a really large Ember app with different modules and Ember add-ons. We use Ember CLI.
So you're making this really great Ember app, and you're packaging it both for the web and for Android and iOS. And I have a few questions about that. So you're packaging this. Do you sign people up directly, or how do users get to your app?
Very good question. Yes. So most banks, if you go to you actually have to open a bank account in person.
Mm-hmm. And so which banks? Are you selling this to the big banks? Are you selling this to Goldman Sachs?
Right. Thank you for asking that, because I started to explain that and then I went down a rabbit hole of explaining something else technical. It's actually kind of a mission of our company, and at least it was explained to me that what we do is try and enable this great software that is obviously really expensive to develop, to be had by smaller banks that are more focused, and inherently smaller banks are more focused on the community because they are more embedded in the community. They're serving the smaller, more focused market. Credit unions also fall into this, like other nonprofit like banking types of organizations. And the person that started this company is my understanding that he really wanted to sort of level the playing field so that he could create good technology that would enable these companies to compete, or these banks, and specifically credit unions, to compete with larger banks that had more resources and that really they wouldn't be able to compete with them, because who's going to invest in a local credit union that may give you a better loan or can really benefit the community and put the money back into the community if you can't even access their services in a modern way? And so that's sort of like the heart of our company.
Say that's huge. I actually just switched to doing business banking with a bank that uses Q2, and it's fantastic.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's way better than the credit union I use for my personal stuff, which does not use Q2.
Hey, that's great.
Yeah.
That's really awesome. Yeah, we have a whole team that does the commercial banking, and they've put a lot of, we're putting a lot of focus in the commercial stuff right now. So that's not really my realm to talk about those things, but definitely our company is doing a lot of exciting things. And we are using Ember to solve a lot of problems that otherwise would have had to be solved internally, with undoubtedly a lot more fragmentation and gnashing of teeth, I assume. Q2's actually been using Ember since before 1.0. So our app has been around a long time, and it has lots of layers of different Ember syntax in it that we're constantly cleaning up and working on. But it's a testament to like the solid nature of Ember and the size of stuff it allows you to build without getting, stuck.
And the way that it slowly evolved.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely one of my favorite things about Ember, is the way the community has respected, like the way the team has approached semantic versioning. I'm pretty sure everyone's a fan of that when they look around at the different options and things that have happened in other projects. And those people work really hard too, and everyone tries. But I think that our core team and the surrounding community really executed the 1.0 to 2.0 thing exceedingly well.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so you guys are doing some really great community-focused, world-changing stuff. And are you guys hiring?
Yes, I was about to yell that, but you asked in a normal voice, so I will also say it in a normal voice. We are always looking for Ember developers, and it is even more interesting than I described it. And we have focused JavaScript. We are a very focused specialist kind of company to where we hire people just to work on Ember and nothing else. And I think there's about 40 of us, all broken up into a lot smaller teams, and that sort of is growing and changing, and we have a lot going on, but it's a really great, fast moving place to work.
Awesome.
Definitely you can reach out to me on Twitter.
Awesome. And are you guys hiring junior, mid-level, senior?
Reach out.
All right.
Definitely senior, and you should always just reach out and then see what happens. Go from there. If you are doing Ember and you are listening to the podcast and you're investing your time in Ember and best practices around Ember, then if you care about those things, there's a good chance that we want to hear from you. So
awesome. That's really exciting. Obviously, we spent most of the time talking about functional programming, so I might have you back on for season 2 in around 6 months.
Where we talk about more functional programming?
Well, yes, probably. But what I'm saying is we'll intend to talk more about Ember and how Q2 is using it. And then we'll actually end up talking about functional programming.
Maybe we can talk about like actor concurrency and web workers in Ember or something interesting by then.
Yeah.
We can give a little teaser or something.
Next time on Real World Ember. This is the end of the show, but here's a message from our sponsor. Our sponsor who happens to be me. So I run emberscreencast.com. If you're an intermediate level developer, then this site is for you. So you've read your introductory book and you're ready to get started, but you're not quite into reading the source code yet. So I go and I explain some of the basics, but I also explain cool add-ons and some intermediate to advanced topics as well. So go ahead and check out emberscreencast.com. 2 screencasts released every week for the intermediate Ember developer. I hope to see you there.